going on, guys? Today we are going to talk a little bit about bass and how to break apart your basses to get a really full mix. And what I mean about break apart, I mean literally what different layers we use to create wide, big sounding basses. I made this little demo to be something that had a really wide frequency range. As you can hear, there's a lot of layers going in on the high end here, which often makes it difficult to mix in bass. So I'm going to show you how I created the bass for this track, and hopefully it'll give you some inspiration towards how you can mix bass into your tracks, whatever genre it is. So let me just mute all the basses I've added to this, and let's take a listen to the track with no bass, and then I'll explain each step as I add the bass in. And this is generally the process I use for most tracks that I'm making for bass. So this is the track with no bass. All right, so the way that I like to think about bass is sub bass is going to be a really low end bass, and we're going to hit that last. That's going to be the last thing I cover. But there's a whole other wide range of bass sounds that we hear that really help complement that sub. And those generally live in the mids, the low mids, and then something up in the high end. So let's start with a pad. I always like to add a pad to my subs that's going to fill out that low mid section. Here is the pad that I used for this. I'll just solo it for you so we can listen. And now if we take a look at like the frequency range we got here, you can see I have some cuts already going on here. We're really talking about the low mids and the lows, but I've cut most of the lows out, so we're really just focusing on this section in here. Now what this is going to do is I'll just give you a brief demo of what this sounds like with just this synth in now. So I'll play one bar without it and one bar with it. Okay, that was without. And what this does is start to fill out some of that space down there that's not been used yet. Everything else in this track is in the high end except for the kick. So this is starting to fill out our mids without overwhelming those low mids. So the next step towards it that I add is this guy. And this guy we're going to experiment with some using some return effects. So let's take a listen to this. And this I use to complement that pad, but be a little bit more of like just a straight square sound. So it gets a little bit bigger and our transients really have sharp cuts that the listener can hear. This sound is completely there to work with that pad that we did a second ago. Now let me show you in this sub. It's literally just basically a pretty generic sine wave. It's a little bit different. It's a little in between sine and sawtooth. But where it gets interesting is in our return channel up here. So I'm just going to turn this return off so you can listen to it, and then I'm going to build a new return and explain why I like to use returns specifically for our low mid part of our bass. So let's listen again to the sound with no return track. It's actually kind of hard to hear because there's not a lot of frequencies coming out of a sine wave. So the reason I like to create new return tracks for some of these sine waves is I want to pull out some other frequencies out of this that I can use saturation and distortion to get that from. So what I'll do is I will initiate return track number 6. Now if you don't know how to use returns, I have other tutorials talking about how to do that. I would recommend watching that first because I'm not going to go into what a return really does very much right here. So because I won't have time in this tutorial. But I am initiating number 6 because this is a return that's unused. As I can see over here, I have no return effect selected. So now I'm going to go up to where the returns live, and I'm just going to, right click on another return, and then let's create a Scream 4 distortion. And this is going to create our new return. As we look over to 6 here now, we're going to see number 6, Scream 3. Cool. So let's turn up this return pretty loud so we can take a listen to it. As I add a distortion to a bass, what you're going to hear is that it's going to distort it so loud that we're going to actually lose some of those lower and low mid-range frequencies from this distortion. And there is one way around that, but let's listen to this right now. Actually, let's use the warp setting. I really like this bass, this for basses. Now it's cool, it's added a nice top layer to that sound, but we do lose some of that low end with just this on it. So what we're gonna do to get rid of that is I wanna be able to EQ this distortion. And yeah, we have an EQ within Scream 4, but I'd rather use a fab filter. I wanna really get in there and cut out what I don't need. So what I'm gonna have you do now is combine this Scream 4. And what that does is it means that this is still our return track, but now if I right click on this and add other effects to it, these effects are going to directly affect our master return, which is always going to be this Scream 4, meaning a reverb. If I added a reverb anywhere else, it would create a whole new return track. But because I've combined this, all of our effects are going to go on this distortion. So from here on out, I'm just going to add a Fab Filter Pro Q2. You could use whatever EQ you want, but the main point of this is that we're going to have a low cut that is going to cut out the low frequencies. Now, I like the reason I like Fab Filter is because you can decide what kind of dB cut you want, which will make this cut much steeper. So let's go down to 72. I want a really steep cliff kind of cut. And let's take a look at this. Cut out that. That's really what I'm going for in here. This cuts out all the bass, lets all the beautiful sine wave shine through below it, but then above it, we're gonna get really nice, new crunchy distorted version of that sine wave. So I'm just gonna kind of start tweaking some stuff, and I'll talk as I do. All right, so now that I have this sound going, I'm going to create a simple delay, and we're going to do the Haas effect, which many of you guys know. I just want to widen out this bass a bit. So what I'm going to do to it is I'm going to take the feedback and bring it down to 0. I'm going to bring this pan over to the left side, and then I'm going to go into the milliseconds mode and bring this to somewhere around 20 to 30 milliseconds, which is going to give us a really quick delay just on the left side. And then I'm going to take the dry wet and put it maybe around a quarter of the way up, somewhere around 22. And that way, we're going to get a little bit of a bounce back on the left ear, which is going to make this sound wider. Let's take a listen. Yeah, I'm getting a nice wide sound from that now. And then lastly, let's just use one of my favorite old stock Reason effects, which is the RV7 digital reverb. And let's go to the small room. Bring that dry wet down a bit. Bring the decay down a bit and the size down a bit, maybe both sitting at 16. And let's take a listen. Cool. Now, I don't think we're going to want this much effect on it, but let's take a listen to what this return sound effect sounds like without the sine at all. And the way to listen to just the effect on its own is to hit the pre-sine, which is going to put this effect on pre-fader, and then we can take the fader all the way down. And now this way we're going to hear just the effect. Let's scoop out a few more frequencies. Sorry, lost my place. Yeah, cool, that sounds pretty nice. So now we can just bring this fader back up a bit, turn off the solo, and don't forget to turn off that pre-fader effect. All right, and let's go back to our sequencer and see where we're at. Okay. You can hear that's a big difference. This was just the sine before that return effect, and that's after. And these two sound really nice together now. This is going to be our low mid-range. So now that we have those, let's take a listen to the next part of the bass, which is going to be the high end, which I generally like to use something sawtoothy sounding for this. Now this is really something you don't want to put too much of, or you're going to end up conflicting with your leads. So be very careful with how much of this you add in. But let's take a listen to what this sounds like on its own. This is going to be the high end of our bass. So you can see, I think it's just a simple, let's see. Yeah, I used just a simple preset from Nexus and added a bit of distortion, a little bit of EQing, and that's pretty much it. So what's interesting about this sound is that there's no lows at all. So most people wouldn't call this a bass, but this is completely just to complement the sub part of the bass. But let's hear what it sounds like with the other two basses we've listened to so far. So now we have this. Now I took all three of these sounds, and instead of having them go out of the master section, I created a new output bus, which I called bass. And you just do that by clicking new output bus, which is gonna bring up a new bus right here. And I named it bass. So I have all three of those basses going to this bass here, where I have some sidechain compression around the kick, I put in a little EQing, and then I put in a compressor. I used the C4 compressor, which is an awesome compressor from Waves. It's a multi-band parametric processor, which means that we actually are able to compress specific frequency ranges, which is really nice. But the reason that I did that is because putting a compressor on all three of these bass sounds is really going to glue everything together and make these mids and these highs sound really nice together. I can play it for you guys without and on. I don't know if you're going to be able to hear it, but let's give it a go. It's no compression. Here's compression. And let's listen to that in the mix. Now, just so you can hear, again, we have this high sound, this mid square sound, and this pad. All right, so lastly, what do we need? We need some sub bass. So the sub bass I don't have going into this bus, and the reason I don't put it into the bass bus is because I don't want to have that same EQ on this sub, because there's some frequencies I took out. I think if we look at this fab filter, you can see I cut everything in the low end on here to really leave room for the sub bass. So now that we add the sub bass, we're going to be able to fill up this range down here. If I put it into this bass bus, that sub would get cut. So that's why I'm going to leave this sub bass on its own. Now, the sub on its own sounds like this. Very simple, just sine bass. I do have a compressor on it. I do also have some sidechain compression going. But let me add each other sound now, each part of the bass. So now I'm going to add in the high part, which really complements this sub. Nice. Now we'll add in that first mid bass. And let's add in that other mid bass. Now listen to how full that is. When I first started producing, I generally was just focusing on the low subs and not paying attention to these other parts of the low mids. Listen to how much bigger this is than just a sub on its own. It's pretty cool. That versus that. It's a big difference. Now, a good thing to do, one final thing I'll tell you to do while you're mixing your bass, is it's important to listen to each bass in the mix on its own and listen to different variations of other parts of that bass alone, because you're going to get a good mix. So what I like to do is I'll be like, all right, let's mute the sub. Make sure everything's sounding good. So this was kind of a little bit about sound design for bass, but mostly about mixing bass. Really think about your bass as highs, mids, and lows. Find the right place for those and mix all of them separately and then together to get a really good tight bass and mix up your track. Hope you guys enjoyed this. There is a dog barking and screaming in my hallway. I apologize for that if you could hear it, but I'll see you guys in a couple days with a brand new tutorial.